So welcome to Miss Keith's discussion about division that is slightly more complicated than the division that you did in third grade. So normally when we talk about division in algebra, we're not really talking about long division. We're talking about something involving fractions. So a couple of things to keep in mind about fractions. Number one, some of the fractions that you'll see today will have square roots in them. If that is the case, you cannot ever leave a negative inside of a square root. Hopefully you remember that from back before fall break. We talked about if there's ever a negative in the square root, that means we have imaginary answers. Okay? The other thing that involves fractions that I cannot have, if I'm dealing with imaginary numbers, which sometimes you will be today, you can never leave an I in the denominator or in the bottom of a fraction. So with that in mind, if I look at example A, that looks like something that you might see if you had done the quadratic formula and gotten your answer, okay? What's wrong with this answer right now is that it's not simplified. First of all, there's still a negative inside the square root. So first of all, I'm going to take care of that negative. I'm not going to change the negative 8 or the 2. That's going to stay the same. But what is going to change is instead of having the square root of negative 48, it's going to be the square root of 48 with a little I there right next to it on the outside. There's step one. Step two is I want to see if I can simplify that square root of 48 using my factor tree. So I kind of come over to the side on my paper and I say, okay, what goes into 48? Well, there's many different things. Me personally, I'm going to use 16 and 3. Okay. Well, then I can't split up 3 anymore, but I can split up 16 into 4 and 4. And right there, I get a pair of 4s, so I don't have to split them up anymore. I already have a pair. So here's what that means. I still haven't changed the negative 8 or the 2. But what I have just done is now instead of having the square root of 48, I know there's a pair of 4s inside of 48. Well, if a number has a partner, it gets to go outside the square root. So the 4 gets to go outside the square root. That lonely little 3 that I didn't circle has to stay inside. And now there's only one more step and I'm done. Whenever I'm dealing with fractions, I always have to make sure I reduce. So I'm not worried about the square root of 3. Okay? None of the other numbers have square roots, so those are not like terms. What I am worried about is these numbers outside the square root. Negative 8 over 2 can reduce. That can reduce down to negative 4. 4 over 2 can also reduce. That'll reduce down to 2. And then the square root of 3 just stays there. And now I'm done. So step 1 was get rid of the negative. Step 2 was do my factor tree. Step 3 was reduce that fraction if I can. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. If I look at question B, I've got a completely different problem. There's no radicals, but there is an I in the bottom of the fraction. So somehow I've got to cancel out that I, and here's how I do that. Right now I have a 4 minus 5i. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by what is called the conjugate of that. And what that means is it has an opposite sign. So I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by 4 plus 5i. So let's go through that process. Let's start with the top. Okay? I'm going to put these in parentheses just to remind myself that I need to distribute. So on top, if I multiply this out, I start with 3 times 4, and that gives me a 12. Then I've got 3 times 5i, which is 15i. Now I go back and I distribute the 2i. So 2i times 4 gives me 8i, and 2i times 5i gives me 10i squared. So this should look very, very familiar to what you did yesterday. So at this point, I have some like terms that I can put together there. I have 15 and 8i. Well, if I put those together, those become 23i. And then at the very end there, I have a 10i squared. And if you remember from yesterday, I squared is the same thing as negative 1. So what I actually have right here is I have a 12 out front. I now have a negative 10 at the end because of that I squared. So 12 minus 10 gives me a 2. So there's what I'm going to have on the top of my fraction right there. Okay. Now let's go back and take a look at the bottom, multiply that out. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if I've done this correctly, my i's should all cancel out. So I distribute the bottom. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 5i is 20i. Okay. Then I go and I distribute the negative 5i. So negative 5i times 4 is negative 20i. And the very last thing here, I have negative 5i times positive 5i. Well, negative 5 times 5 is negative 25. And I times I is I squared. Okay? And if you notice right here, look what just happened to your i's. You have a positive 20i and a negative 20i. Well, those canceled out. And all you're left with is 16 minus 25i squared. So what happens with that I squared? Well, that's negative 1. So it changes the sign on my negative 25. So what I actually have here is 16 plus 25, which is, let's see if I can do math, 41. So let's look at what my final answer would be. When I multiplied this out on top, I got 23i and 2. On bottom, once I simplified 16 minus 25i squared, I got 41. And there's my answer right there. I always check to see if I can reduce, but there's nothing that goes into 2 and 23 and 41, so I'm done right there. A lot of people will write the 2 in front of the 23i, but technically either way is a correct answer. So go ahead. You should have already started on the practice yesterday. You should have done the circled problems. So go ahead, pick up where you left off. Now go ahead and do the non-circled problems on that coloring page.